Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we are going back to America in the year **1854. We are going to Charleston, South Carolina, a beautiful and busy city whose streets were filled with elegant buildings, horse-drawn carriages, merchants, travelers, and thousands of ordinary people. But beneath that beautiful surface was a deeply disturbing reality. Slavery was still legal, and for enslaved black people, freedom was not something they could simply choose. Families could be separated, people could be bought and sold, and an ordinary morning could suddenly become the beginning of an entirely different life. Tonight's story follows a young black woman whose life changed in one of the most frightening ways imaginable. She was taken to a slave auction, but something unusual happened there. The bidding for her became unexpectedly intense. One man after another raised the price, and eventually, a wealthy buyer offered an astonishing amount of money for her. But why? Why would anyone pay so much? Who was this young woman? And what was hidden inside the old documents connected to her past? Tonight we will slowly uncover the story. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm historical stories like this, please subscribe to Boring History for Sleep *. Share this video with someone who loves history, and stay with us until the very end. Thank you for being here. Now make yourself comfortable, turn down the lights, relax, and let us travel quietly back to Charleston in the year 1854. The morning began like many other mornings. The sun was already rising above the rooftops. Golden light touched the brick buildings and white columns of Charleston. Horse-drawn carriages moved slowly through the streets. The sound of wooden wheels could be heard against the road. Merchants opened their shops. Workers carried boxes and baskets. People walked from one street to another. From a distance, the city looked peaceful. But not far away, inside a crowded building, a young woman stood quietly. She was trying not to show how frightened she was. She knew that something was about to happen. She simply did not know exactly what. Her name was known to the people around her. But in that room, her name seemed less important than a number, a price, a value, a figure that someone would eventually offer for her. She looked down at the small leather bag in her hands. It was old and worn. There was nothing expensive inside, a few pieces of clothing, a small personal object, perhaps something that reminded her of the life she had known before that morning. She held the bag tightly. It was one of the few things that still felt like it belonged to her. Around her, people moved quietly. Some were waiting, some were talking, others were watching. She could hear men's voices outside. They were discussing business. They were discussing prices. They were discussing people as though they were objects. The young woman tried to remain calm. She looked toward the door. For a moment nobody spoke. Then the door opened. A man appeared. He looked toward her. Then he called her forward. She took a slow breath and began walking. Each step felt heavier than the one before. She entered the larger room. There were people gathered there. Some were buyers. Some were observers. Some were simply there because auctions were part of the business world of the city. The young woman looked at the crowd. She tried to understand what they were thinking, but their faces revealed very little. She stood quietly. The auctioneer prepared his papers. He looked down at his notes. Then he looked toward the crowd. The auction was about to begin. The young woman knew what that meant. Soon strangers would decide how much money they were willing to pay for her. Soon she would no longer know where she would live. She would no longer know who would control her life, and she had no way to stop it. The auctioneer began speaking. His voice was calm, almost ordinary. He described her age, her appearance, her skills, her condition. The words were spoken like a description of merchandise. The young woman stood still. She tried not to react, but inside she was terrified. The first bid was announced, then another. A second man raised the price. Someone else answered. The numbers began to rise. At first, the bidding moved slowly. Then something changed. A wealthy-looking man near the front raised his hand. The auctioneer announced his offer. Another buyer immediately responded. The wealthy man raised his bid again. The room became quieter. People began paying closer attention. The young woman looked from one man to another. She did not understand why the bidding was becoming so intense. The price continued to rise, higher and higher. Several people who had been interested moments earlier stopped bidding. But two men continued. One would raise the price. The other would answer. The auctioneer repeated each new amount. The young woman stood silently in the middle of the room. She could feel every eye watching. Then one of the men finally stepped back. Only one bidder remained. The auctioneer looked around the room. He repeated the final offer. There was silence, no one raised a hand. The auctioneer struck the table. The sale was complete. The young woman had been sold. But what she did not know yet was that the man who had purchased her was not simply another buyer. His decision would eventually lead to questions about her past. And years later, old documents would raise an even bigger question. Why had he been willing to pay so much? At that moment, however, she knew only one thing. She had been separated from the life she knew. A stranger now had control over where she would go. She held her small leather bag. She looked once toward the doorway. Then she followed the people who came to take her away. Outside, Charleston continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Carriages continued moving. Shops continued opening. People continued walking through the streets. The city did not stop. But for the young woman, everything had changed. She was placed inside a horse-drawn carriage. The wooden door closed. For a few moments she sat completely still. She could hear the horses outside. Then the carriage began to move slowly at first, then faster. Charleston began passing outside the window. She looked through the opening. She saw familiar buildings, familiar streets, places she had seen many times before, but now they looked different. She knew she was leaving. She did not know whether she would ever return. The carriage moved farther away. The buildings became less familiar. The streets became quieter. The young woman looked down at her small bag. She held it against herself. It was the only thing she had left that reminded her of her former life. For a long time she said nothing. She simply watched the road. The man who had purchased her was traveling in the same direction. But he remained distant. He did not explain why he had paid such a high price. He did not explain what would happen next. The young woman had questions, many questions, but she had no answers. Eventually, the city disappeared behind them. The road continued through the South Carolina countryside. Large trees stood beside the road. Wooden fences stretched across fields. Occasional houses appeared in the distance. The afternoon sun became warmer. The young woman looked outside again. She realized that she was entering a completely different part of her life. A life she had not chosen. A life she could not control. But somewhere inside her another feeling was beginning to appear. It was not hope yet. It was something quieter. Curiosity. She wanted to understand why this had happened. Why had the bidding become so intense? Why had that particular man wanted her? And what did her past have to do with the strange documents that would eventually come to light? She did not know the answers. Not yet. For now, all she could do was continue traveling. The carriage moved along the long road. The sun slowly began to descend, and behind her, Charleston disappeared completely from view. Ahead of her was a new house, a new place, a new life, and a secret that had been hidden for years. The young woman did not know it yet, but the story of her life was only beginning. The carriage continued along the road as the afternoon slowly faded into evening. The young woman remained quiet. For much of the journey she simply watched the landscape through the small carriage window. The field seemed endless. Large trees stood beside the road, their branches moving gently in the warm breeze. Every now and then they passed another wagon or a small farmhouse. But the farther they traveled, the less familiar everything became. She had spent much of her life around Charleston. She knew its streets. She knew its sounds. She knew where people gathered in the mornings, and where the busiest roads became quiet after sunset. Now all of that was behind her. She wondered what kind of place waited at the end of the road. The man who had purchased her remained mostly silent. He occasionally spoke to the driver, but he did not speak much to her. That silence made the journey even more frightening. She wanted to ask questions. Where were they going? How far was the house? Who lived there? What would be expected of her? But she already knew that asking questions could sometimes make a difficult situation worse. So she remained silent. She held her small leather bag tightly. Inside were the few belongings she had managed to keep. They were simple things, yet now they felt incredibly important. They were reminders of a life that was disappearing behind her. As the sun began to fall lower in the sky, the road became quieter. The light turned golden. Long shadows stretched across the fields. The young woman looked outside once more. For a brief moment she saw a small group of birds flying across the sky. She watched them until they disappeared behind the trees. Then she lowered her eyes. She thought about Charleston. She thought about the people she had known. She thought about the places she might never see again. And most of all, she wondered what would happen to her now. Eventually, the carriage slowed. The driver turned onto a narrower road. The road was surrounded by tall trees and wooden fences. The young woman sat up slightly. Something told her they were getting close. A few minutes later, she saw the roof of a large house in the distance. The house stood beyond a long dirt pathway. It was much larger than the places she had known before. A wide wooden porch stretched across the front. Tall windows reflected the fading sunlight. Large trees surrounded the property. The carriage continued toward the house. The young woman watched carefully. She tried to understand what kind of place this was. Finally, the carriage stopped. The driver climbed down. The door opened. For a moment, the young woman did not move. Then she slowly stepped outside. Her feet touched the ground. She looked toward the house. Several people were standing on the porch. They watched her arrival. Some appeared curious. Others seemed indifferent. The young woman held her leather bag close. She climbed the wooden steps. Each step brought her closer to the doorway. At the entrance, she stopped. She took one final look toward the road. The carriage that had brought her was still there. For a moment, she wondered whether she could somehow return. But she knew she could not. She turned toward the house. Then she stepped inside. The interior was quiet. The floor was made of polished wood. There were simple pieces of furniture along the walls. A staircase led toward the upper floor. Large windows allowed the last daylight of the evening to enter. The young woman looked around carefully. Everything was unfamiliar. Then she noticed another black woman standing nearby. The woman was older, perhaps much older. Her face showed years of experience. She looked at the young woman for several seconds. Neither spoke. Then the older woman gave her a small, reassuring expression. It was not exactly a smile, but it was enough to make the young woman feel slightly less alone. The older woman eventually said that she would show her where she could put her belongings. The young woman followed. They walked through a narrow hallway. Then they entered a small room. There was a simple wooden bed, a small table, a chair, and a window looking toward the yard. It was not much, but it was private. The young woman placed her leather bag on the table. For the first time since leaving Charleston, she was alone. She sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet. She looked around. Then she slowly opened her bag. She touched the few objects inside. Each one reminded her of home. She wondered how long she would be allowed to keep them. She wondered whether anyone from her former life would ever know where she had gone. Outside, she could hear footsteps, people moving around the house. Voices coming from the kitchen, the sound of dishes, then the sound of a door closing. Life in the house continued, but she remained sitting on the bed. She was exhausted, yet sleep did not come easily. Her mind was filled with questions. The auction, the unusually high price, the man who bought her, the journey, the new house, everything seemed connected somehow. But she could not understand how. Eventually, she lay down. The room became darker. Moonlight entered through the window. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow would be her first full day in this unfamiliar place, and she had no idea what it would bring. Morning came quietly. The first light entered through the window. The young woman woke before most of the household. For a few seconds she forgot where she was. Then she remembered. Charleston was far away. This was her new reality. She stood up. She folded her blanket. Then she carefully arranged her few belongings. After that, she left the room. The house was already beginning to wake. In the kitchen, people were preparing breakfast. Wood crackled in the fireplace. Pots and pans moved across the table. The smell of food filled the room. The older woman she had met the previous evening noticed her. She called her over. The young woman approached quietly. The older woman showed her what needed to be done. At first, everything felt unfamiliar, but the young woman watched carefully. She learned quickly. She had learned to observe people, to notice small details, to understand what was expected without always being told. As the morning continued, she began to understand the routine of the household. There were chores, there were schedules, there were people who came and went, there were rules, and there were things nobody explained. That last part interested her. She noticed that certain subjects made people uncomfortable. Whenever the auction was mentioned, conversations became shorter. Whenever her previous life was discussed, people became quiet. She began to wonder why. Was there something about her past that other people knew? Something that she herself had never been told? One afternoon, she was working near the kitchen when the older woman approached her. The older woman looked around to make sure nobody else was listening. Then she quietly asked whether the young woman remembered anything about her family. The question surprised her. She stopped working. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she began talking about what she remembered. Not much, only small memories. A face, a voice, a street, a house, a few names from childhood. The older woman listened carefully. When the young woman finished, the older woman remained silent. Her expression had changed. It was almost as if she had heard something she had been expecting. The young woman noticed. She asked what was wrong. The older woman hesitated. Then she said there were things the young woman needed to know. But not there, not in the kitchen, not where anyone could overhear them. The young woman felt a sudden chill. She knew then that her story was more complicated than she had imagined. The older woman looked toward the doorway. Then she quietly told her that the truth about her past had been hidden for a very long time, and perhaps, she said, it was time for someone to finally uncover it. The older woman looked toward the doorway once again. She seemed to be making sure that nobody was listening. Then she lowered her voice. She told the young woman that some things were better discussed in private. The young woman followed her into a quieter room. They sat together near a window. For several moments neither woman spoke. Finally, the older woman asked her to remember everything she could about her childhood. The young woman closed her eyes. She tried to search through the memories in her mind. Some memories were clear. Others were almost completely gone. She remembered a small room. She remembered the sound of someone singing. She remembered the smell of cooking food. She remembered a woman who had once held her hand. But she could not remember exactly what happened afterward. Her memories became confused. There had been a separation. People had disappeared. And eventually, she had found herself living a completely different life. The older woman listened carefully. Then she asked whether the young woman remembered a particular name. The name sounded familiar, very familiar, but the young woman could not immediately place it. She repeated the name quietly. The older woman nodded. She said that the name had once been connected to a family that lived in Charleston. The young woman stared at her. She asked how she knew that. The older woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she told her that many years earlier, certain papers had been created. Those papers recorded names, transactions, changes in ownership, and sometimes family relationships. The young woman felt confused. She asked whether her name was written in those papers. The older woman said that it might be. That answer changed everything. Until that moment, the young woman had believed that her past was simply lost. Now she realized that perhaps it had been recorded somewhere. Perhaps someone had written down what happened to her. Perhaps there was an explanation for why she had been separated from the people she remembered. She asked where these records were kept. The older woman hesitated. She explained that old records could sometimes be found in Charleston. But finding the correct document would not be easy. There were many ledgers, many names, many transactions, and many records had been damaged, misplaced, or forgotten. Still, the young woman wanted to know. She wanted answers. For the first time since the auction, she felt that there was something she could actively pursue. She might not be able to control where she lived. She might not be able to control what happened to her. But perhaps she could discover the truth about where she came from. The older woman warned her to be careful. Searching through old records could attract attention. Some people did not want old stories brought back into the light. The young woman understood. She had already learned that silence could protect people, but silence could also hide the truth. That evening, she returned to her small room. She sat beside the window. Outside, the property was becoming quiet. The sun had disappeared. The sky was dark. A few lights could be seen through the windows of the main house. The young woman thought about everything the older woman had told her. A name, a family, old documents, a hidden story, and perhaps a connection to the strange auction that had brought her there. She wondered about the man who had bought her. Why had he been willing to pay such a high price? Was it because of her skills? Was it because of something he knew about her family? Or was there another reason? She had no answer. But now she had a reason to search. The following days passed slowly. She continued working. She learned the household routine. She became more familiar with the other people living there. And she continued speaking privately with the older woman whenever they had an opportunity. Little by little, more pieces of the story appeared. The older woman told her that Charleston had once been filled with people whose lives were connected through complicated networks of families, businesses, plantations, merchants, and slave traders. Documents had been created for almost everything: sales, debts, property, inheritance, and sometimes enslaved people were listed alongside other forms of property. The young woman found this difficult to hear, but she listened. She wanted to understand the world that had controlled her life. One afternoon, the older woman brought her something. It was an old folded paper. The edges were worn, the paper had become yellow with age. The young woman stared at it. She asked where it had come from. The older woman said it had been kept for years. Then she placed it on the table. The young woman carefully unfolded it. There were handwritten marks across the page, names, numbers, dates. She could not understand everything. But then she saw something that made her stop. A name she remembered from childhood. Her heart began beating faster. She looked again. Perhaps she had made a mistake. She leaned closer. The name was still there. She asked the older woman whether she knew what it meant. The older woman looked at the document. Then she looked back at the young woman. She said that the document might be more important than either of them had realized. The young woman asked why. The older woman explained that the record appeared to connect several people, and one of those people might have been connected to her family. The young woman felt overwhelmed. For years she had believed that the people from her childhood were simply gone. Now, suddenly, she was holding a piece of paper that suggested otherwise. She asked whether the document could tell her where she had come from. The older woman said that it might, but they needed more evidence. One document was not enough. They needed to find the original record, and perhaps other documents connected to it. That meant returning to Charleston. The young woman looked toward the window. Charleston, the city she had left behind, the city she never expected to see again. Now she might have a reason to return. But returning would not be simple. She knew that. There were people who might recognize her. There were people who might ask questions. And there were people who might not want her searching through the past. Still, she had made her decision. She would search. She would find the records. And she would discover why her life had changed so suddenly. A few days later, she prepared to leave. She carried her small leather bag once again. But this time there was something else inside. A carefully folded copy of the old document. She kept it hidden among her belongings. She said goodbye quietly to the older woman. Then she stepped outside. The road toward Charleston waited ahead. The young woman climbed into the carriage. As the horses began moving, she looked back at the house. She did not know whether she would return. But this journey was different. The first time she had traveled this road, she had been taken away against her will. This time she was traveling because she wanted answers. The carriage moved slowly down the road. The trees passed by. The field stretched into the distance, and somewhere ahead was Charleston. Somewhere inside that city were old records, old names, old secrets, and perhaps the truth about the young woman whose life had been changed forever by one extraordinary auction. The carriage moved steadily toward Charleston. The young woman sat quietly inside, holding her small leather bag close. The old document was hidden safely among her belongings. Every few minutes she looked through the carriage window. The countryside slowly changed. The roads became busier. More houses appeared. Then, in the distance, she began to recognize the familiar outline of Charleston. For a moment she simply watched. She had not expected to feel so many emotions at once. There was fear. There was sadness. But there was also something she had not felt since the day of the auction. Hope. Not the kind of hope that promised everything would suddenly become easy. It was a smaller kind. The hope that perhaps an answer existed somewhere. The carriage entered the city. Charleston was busy as usual. Horse-drawn carriages moved through the streets. Merchants called to customers. Workers carried boxes and baskets. People passed one another without paying much attention to the young woman. But she was paying attention to everything. She remembered certain streets from her childhood, a corner, a building, a doorway, a tree beside an old wall. Each familiar detail brought back another memory. She wondered how much of her old life was still there. The carriage eventually stopped near a records office. The young woman stepped down. She looked at the building. It was not impressive. It was an old structure with large windows and a heavy wooden door. But inside, she hoped, were the answers she had been searching for. She entered carefully. The air smelled of old paper and wood. Shelves filled the room. Ledgers were stacked everywhere. Some were large and heavy. Others were small enough to carry with one hand. An elderly clerk sat behind a wooden desk. He looked up when she approached. She explained that she was looking for an old record. The clerk asked what kind. She gave him the name she had learned from the older woman. The clerk thought for a moment. Then he asked whether she knew the approximate year. She gave him the year. He stood. He walked toward a shelf. After several minutes he returned with an old leather-bound book. He placed it on the desk. The young woman stared at it. This could be the record. Her hands trembled slightly. The clerk opened the ledger. Page after page passed, names, dates, numbers, transactions. The young woman watched carefully. Then suddenly she saw something familiar. She leaned forward. There it was, the name, the same name that had appeared on the document the older woman had shown her. She felt a sudden rush of emotion. She asked the clerk to turn back. He did. She pointed toward the entry. The clerk read it carefully. Then his expression changed. He looked at the young woman. He asked whether she was related to the people listed there. She did not know what to say. She simply told him that she believed there was a connection. The clerk studied the record again. Then he turned several pages. He found another entry. Then another. The young woman watched in silence. Something was becoming clear. Her family had not disappeared completely. They had been recorded. Their lives had been written down in documents. Names had been entered. Transfers had been recorded. Relationships had been noted. The problem was that the records did not tell the entire story. Some pages were missing, others were damaged, and some information was written so briefly that it was difficult to understand. Still, the young woman continued searching. The clerk eventually brought out another ledger. This one was older. The leather cover was cracked. The pages were yellow. He opened it carefully. The young woman leaned closer. Then she saw a familiar name again, but this time something was different. Beside the name was a number, a very large number. The young woman stared at it. She realized that it was connected to a transaction, a sale. Her heart sank. She asked the clerk what the entry meant. He explained that the record appeared to document a transaction involving an enslaved person. The young woman looked at the page for a long time. She knew what that meant. Someone had once written down the price of a human life, and now she was standing there reading it. The clerk continued searching. Then he found another record. This one was connected to the auction. The young woman could hardly breathe. She asked him to show it to her. He turned the ledger toward her. She looked at the entry. The date matched. The location matched. And then she saw something that made her stop completely. The buyer's name. It was the same man who had purchased her. For a moment she could not speak. The mystery had suddenly become much more complicated. She had always wondered why he had paid so much. Now she knew that the transaction had been recorded. But the record did not explain why. It only showed the amount. The young woman asked whether there were any other documents. The clerk said there might be. He explained that wealthy families often kept private records in addition to official documents. Letters, personal ledgers, property records, inheritance papers, family correspondence. If the buyer had a particular reason for purchasing her, the explanation might be hidden somewhere else. The young woman thanked the clerk. Before leaving, she carefully copied the information she needed. She did not take anything that did not belong to her. She simply wrote down the dates and names. Then she stepped outside. Charleston was still busy. People continued moving through the streets. But the young woman felt different. She now had something she had never possessed before. Evidence, not answers, but evidence. She walked slowly down the street. Her mind was racing. Why had that man paid such a large amount? Was he trying to help someone? Was he protecting a family secret? Was there a connection between him and her family? Or was the reason something even more complicated? She remembered the old woman's warning. Some people did not want the past brought back into the light. Perhaps that was why so many records were difficult to find. Perhaps some stories had been deliberately forgotten. The young woman returned to the carriage. She climbed inside. But before the carriage left Charleston, she looked back at the city. She knew she would have to return again. There were still too many unanswered questions. The most important one remained. Why her? Why had the bidding for her become so intense? And why had one man been willing to pay so much? The answer was somewhere in Charleston. Maybe in an old letter. Maybe in a private family ledger. Maybe inside a house she had never seen. Or perhaps in the memories of someone who had known her family many years earlier. The carriage began moving. The city slowly disappeared behind her. She held her small leather bag. Inside it was the copy of the record. She looked down at it. For years her past had been a mystery. Now she had found the first real piece of the puzzle. But she did not yet understand what the entire picture would reveal. And the most important clue was still waiting for her. The carriage carried her away from Charleston once again. But this time the young woman was not thinking about the road. She was thinking about the name she had seen in the old ledger, the name of the man who had purchased her, and the amount he had paid. The number continued to repeat itself in her mind. Why had he paid so much? There had to be a reason. When she finally returned to the house, evening had already arrived. The older woman was waiting for her. She could immediately see that something had happened. The young woman sat down and carefully removed the copy of the record from her bag. She placed it on the table. The older woman looked at it. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she slowly sat down. She recognized the information. The young woman asked her whether she knew about this record. The older woman admitted that she had heard rumors years ago, but she had never seen the official document. Now that it was in front of them, the situation was different. The young woman asked the question that had been troubling her since the auction. Why did that man pay so much? The older woman looked toward the window. She seemed reluctant to answer. Finally, she said that the buyer had been connected to an influential family in the region. The young woman asked what kind of connection. The older woman explained that the family had owned large amounts of property and had been involved in many business dealings. But there was more. The buyer had also known people connected to the young woman's family. The young woman became completely still. She asked whether he had known her before the auction. The older woman said she could not be certain, but there were indications that he had. That possibility changed everything. If the buyer already knew something about her, then the auction might not have been a random sale. The young woman remembered the way he had looked at her. He had not seemed surprised when he saw her. He had seemed almost certain, as though he already knew exactly what he wanted. She began to wonder whether he had been searching for her. Perhaps the auction had not been the beginning of the story. Perhaps it had been the final step in something that had started many years earlier. The older woman told her there was another possibility. The buyer might have purchased her because of an old debt. The young woman looked confused. The older woman explained that enslaved people were sometimes transferred as part of complicated financial arrangements. A person could be listed in an estate, transferred with property, included in a debt settlement, or moved between families after an inheritance. The young woman listened carefully. She realized that her life had been caught inside a system of contracts and financial records. Her existence had been reduced to entries on paper. But she also realized something else. If there were records, then there might be answers. The next morning she began searching again. This time she did not return to Charleston immediately. Instead, she asked whether there were private records kept in the house. The older woman told her there might be. Large families often kept old papers in trunks, cabinets, attics, or locked rooms. The young woman asked whether she knew where those papers were stored. The older woman thought for a moment. Then she remembered an old storage room near the back of the house. The room had not been used regularly for years. The young woman waited until the house became quiet. Then the two women went there together. The door was difficult to open. Dust covered the wooden frame. Inside were old boxes, broken furniture, old books, bundles of papers, and several large wooden trunks. The young woman looked around. Her heart began beating faster. Perhaps the answer was somewhere inside that room. They began searching. The older woman opened one box after another. Most contained ordinary household records, receipts, old bills, lists of supplies, letters. Nothing seemed important. Then they opened a large wooden trunk. Inside were dozens of old papers tied together with string. The young woman carefully lifted the first bundle. She opened it. More names, more dates, more transactions. She continued searching. Then suddenly, the older woman stopped. She had found something. It was a letter. The paper was old and slightly damaged. The handwriting was difficult to read. The older woman recognized the handwriting. She said that the letter had been written by someone connected to the buyer. The young woman asked what it said. The older woman began reading. At first, the words seemed ordinary. Then she reached a particular passage. She stopped. The young woman asked what was wrong. The older woman looked at her. She said the letter mentioned a young woman from Charleston, a young woman who had been separated from her family. The young woman felt her heart racing. She asked whether the letter mentioned her name. The older woman looked again, then she nodded. Yes, her name was there. For several seconds neither woman spoke. The young woman could hardly believe it. This was the first direct evidence that someone connected to the buyer had known about her before the auction. She asked when the letter had been written. The date was years earlier, long before the auction. That meant one thing. Someone had known about her long before she was sold. The young woman sat down. She felt overwhelmed. The story she had believed about her life was changing. She had thought that she had simply been caught in the machinery of slavery. Now it seemed possible that her sale had been connected to an older family matter. But what kind of matter? Why had she been separated from her family? Why had her name appeared in a private letter? And why had the buyer paid such an extraordinary amount? The older woman told her that they should stop searching for the night. There were too many questions, and they needed to be careful. The young woman agreed. They put the documents back where they had found them, but before leaving the room she looked once more at the old trunk. She knew that something important was hidden inside it, perhaps the complete truth, perhaps only another piece of the puzzle, but she was determined to find out. That night she returned to her room. She could not sleep. She kept thinking about the letter, the words, the date, her name, everything connected, the auction, the buyer, Charleston, her family, the old records, the hidden letter. It was no longer possible to believe that these events were unrelated. There was a story behind them, and someone had known that story for years. The young woman looked through the window into the darkness. She realized that she had spent most of her life being told what she was allowed to know. Now, for the first time, she was beginning to uncover the truth for herself. And tomorrow she would return to that old trunk, because there was still one bundle of papers they had not opened, and it might contain the answer to the question that had followed her since the auction: why was she worth so much? The next morning arrived quietly. The young woman had barely slept. The old letter had remained in her thoughts throughout the night. Her name had appeared in a document written years before the auction. That single discovery had changed everything. She no longer believed that her sale had been a simple transaction. There was something behind it, something that had begun long before she ever stepped onto the auction platform. As soon as the household became busy, she found the older woman. Neither needed to explain why they were meeting. They both knew what they needed to do. They returned to the old storage room. The wooden door creaked as they opened it. Dust floated through the sunlight coming from a small window. The old trunk was still there. The young woman knelt beside it. She carefully opened the lid. Inside were bundles of papers tied together with faded string. Some were receipts. Some were letters. Some were old estate records. They began opening them one by one. For several minutes they found nothing unusual. Then the older woman picked up another bundle. The string was darker and more worn than the others. She untied it carefully. Inside was a collection of letters. The young woman leaned closer. The first letter was dated many years earlier. The second was from a different year. The third contained a name that the young woman immediately recognized. It was the name of someone from her childhood. She took the letter in her hands. Her fingers trembled. She asked the older woman to read it. The older woman began slowly. The letter described a family separation, a child who had been moved from one household to another, a woman who had desperately tried to keep her family together. The young woman listened. Then she realized something. The letter was describing her own childhood. She looked at the older woman. She could barely speak. The older woman continued reading. The letter suggested that the separation had not happened by accident. There had been a financial dispute, a debt, and a disagreement between two families. The young woman's family had been caught in the middle. Her mother had apparently tried to prevent the separation, but she had been unable to stop it. The young woman closed her eyes. For years she had remembered only fragments. Now those fragments were beginning to make sense. The voice she remembered, the room, the hand holding hers, the sudden separation, the journey away from home, all of it had been connected. She asked what happened to her mother. The older woman looked down at the letter. The answer was not clear. There were references to another household, another transfer, then silence. No clear record remained. The young woman felt a deep sadness. She had spent years wondering what had happened. Now she knew at least part of the answer. But there was still one question. Why had the wealthy buyer purchased her? The older woman returned to the letters. She found another document. This one was different. It was written by the buyer himself. The young woman froze. She asked whether the letter mentioned her. The older woman began reading. At first it discussed business, then property, then an old family matter. Finally, the young woman's name appeared. The room became completely silent. The letter explained that the buyer had been searching for a particular person connected to an old family agreement. He believed that the young woman might be connected to that agreement. That was why he had paid such a high price, not simply because of her labor, not simply because of her appearance, but because of what he believed she represented. The young woman listened carefully. She asked whether he knew who her parents were. The older woman said the letter did not provide a complete answer, but it suggested that her family had once been connected to people of considerable importance. There had been an inheritance, a disputed property claim, and an agreement that had never been properly resolved. The young woman stared at the papers. She had always believed that she had been forgotten. Now she was beginning to understand that someone had been looking for her. But why? The older woman explained that the buyer might have believed that finding her could help settle an old dispute. Perhaps she was the last living person who could connect two sides of a family story. Perhaps her name appeared in a document that had been forgotten. Or perhaps there was something else, something even more valuable. The young woman asked whether the buyer knew about the old letters. The older woman could not say, but she warned her that if he knew the documents existed, he might not want anyone else reading them. The young woman became quiet. For the first time, she realized that the documents were not simply historical records. They could be dangerous. Someone had kept them hidden for years. Someone had chosen not to talk about them, and now she was holding them in her hands. She carefully folded the letter, then she placed it beside the others. She asked the older woman what they should do. The older woman said they needed to find the original family records. The letters provided clues, but they were not enough. They needed proof. They needed to know exactly who her parents were. They needed to know what happened to them, and they needed to understand the old agreement mentioned in the letter. The young woman agreed. She was no longer searching simply because she wanted to know her past. Now she understood that the truth could explain why her life had taken the path it had. The two women spent the rest of the afternoon examining the old papers. They found more names, more dates, more connections. But one name appeared again and again. The same wealthy family, the same group of people, the same property, and eventually the same young woman, her. She sat quietly as the pieces came together. Her life had been recorded in documents she had never known existed. Someone had written about her before she was old enough to understand what was happening. Someone had searched for her. Someone had paid an extraordinary amount of money for her. And now she was beginning to understand why. But there was still one missing piece, the old family agreement. If they could find it, they might finally understand the entire story. The older woman said that the agreement might have been kept somewhere else, perhaps in the buyer's main house, perhaps with an attorney, or perhaps in another Charleston archive. The young woman looked at the old papers. She knew what she had to do. She would return to Charleston again. But this time she would not simply search for her name. She would search for the agreement, the document that might explain everything. That evening she returned to her room. She placed the letters carefully inside her small leather bag. Then she sat beside the window. Outside the house was quiet. The trees moved gently in the night breeze. The young woman looked toward the darkness. For the first time she understood that her past was not gone. It had simply been hidden. And somewhere, perhaps inside another old box, another forgotten ledger, or another faded letter, was the final piece of the story. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow the search would continue.